If the game's telling me that my chances of success are not 100%, I'm not going to like it. And if there's some other option that gets those odds closer to a sure thing, that's what I'm going with. Like, if I'm playing a Fallout game and the VATS system HUD tells me that I have a 60% chance of a headshot, but there's a 95% chance of a body shot, I don't care very much if the target's wearing armor that'll reduce the damage. Reduced damage on a hit still does more than a miss. Or like when I played Pokemon games regularly, I would never teach my Pokemon a move that had less than a 90 in accuracy. And anything with less than 100 in accuracy had better have some stellar reason to include it. I don't care if that ultra-powerful move has the possibility of doing twice the damage as this tried-and-true 100 accuracy move. When your Pokemon is missing over and over, mine will be doing consistent damage. Chipping away consistently just feels better than waiting for some huge move to finally pay off. I'm not a fan of maybes. Maybe it'll work? No, please, I'd prefer the sure thing. Some of you would disagree with me in this regard when it comes to video games, but I have a feeling that when it comes to our spiritual lives, less will be likely to argue the point. Those odds on that leap of faith just seem to be so low. We might have been given a clear signal from God that He wants us to step out in faith, and people of wisdom have added their agreement, but we still hesitate to take that one step. We try to find the assurance, try to seek another angle that'll increase our chances, try to turn that maybe into a definitely. But the truth is that from a human point of view, which is all that we can really ever have, a faithful life for a follower of Jesus is full of maybes. The possibility of failure seems to be ever present. And in some of the most dramatic situations, if that maybe doesn't pan out, our lives will be forfeit. But that's the point of faith, isn't it? If we never felt like we could fail, if we were only asked by God to do the things that we were masters at, then we'd never grow to be more like God. Never grow in righteousness, never grow in holiness, never grow in faithfulness. It's only when we're out of our depths that we can discover the strength that God has placed in us. There's something amazing in our spiritual lives when we stare at nearly impossible odds, and yet still move with faith in God. Some might call it reckless, stupid, idiotic. But if we are moving in line with the will of God, no matter how unlikely the maybe appears from our perspective, it's sitting at 100% from God's perspective. A sure thing that we will grow the way God wants us to, no matter the rest of the situational outcome. This idea of looking at a miserable maybe, but still humbly moving in line with God's plan, takes center stage in our passage for the sermon from 1 Samuel chapter 13 verse 16 to chapter 14 verse 23. This topic has been hinted at throughout our series, A Song of Failures and Hope, the series that's been looking through the book of Samuel. And remember, one of the major themes of this book as a whole is, despite the problems of this life and the human evil that brings it about, God's king will reign and bring restoration to his humble people. This life has many maybes, but God's work is a sure thing for we who humble ourselves to join him in it. So far in the book, we've seen the story arc of Eli the priest and judge, from assumed hope to a failure who chose his son's sinfulness over holy discipline. We've also seen the story arc of Samuel, the prophet and judge who was raised with a priestly background, from rising hope to a failure of growing irrelevance. He's still around in the book, but his role as hoped-in leader has gone. And recently we've been in the story arc of Saul, the first king of Israel who stood among the prophets even if it was only for a day. From a rocky start of rising hope to a failure brought about because of impatience and assumption on what it means to be godly. We saw that point of failure in the last sermon, when we focused on the first part of chapter 13, facing a horde of an enemy army ahead of him and his soldiers melting away in fear behind him. Saul needed something to help him. He believed that an attempt at worship done in the wrong way was better than no worship at all. But mere minutes after attempting it, he found the prophet Samuel filled with the anger of God for the failure, as well as a word that his kingly dynasty was over after him. God would find a king who stood after his own heart, one who would stand in more faith than Saul ever did. And with merely 600 soldiers left to this failed king, he still faced a terrible enemy army, now seemingly without the blessing of God, all because he wouldn't humble himself to act as God had commanded. This is where we come back into the story for our passage. Saul and the Israelites can only see their deficit. their lack when they stand without God. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 16 to 23. And Saul and Jonathan his son and the people who were present with them stayed in Geba of Benjamin. But the Philistines encamped at Michmash. The raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Ophrah, to the land of Shual. Another company turned toward Beth-horon, and another company turned toward the border that looked down on the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, "Lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears." But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for setting the goads. So on the day of the battle there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan. But Saul and Jonathan his son had them, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. This section is largely made up of backstory and setup. Saul and Jonathan and the rest of the army stayed where they had been in the last sermon, and the Philistines used this opportunity to spread out in their strength. Raiding teams split out from the main camp to kill, plunder, and do all the other atrocious things that raiders such as these do. The exact locations of expansion are only important in telling us that they spread out in all directions. Verse 19 then explains another part of the Israelites' lack. Not only had their army shrunk to a few hundred fighters, but pretty much the whole army was fighting with sticks and rocks. The Philistines had a monopoly on blacksmithing. Some historically minded people might want to remind us that the switch from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was happening right at this time in history. And it was the Philistines' crafting of such swords that made them the powerhouses that they were as they spread from their origins of the Mediterranean Sea to the conquering spread at the time of Saul's kingship. But we have to let the passage explain the situation to us. The verse doesn't say that there were only bronze smiths in Israel, while the Philistines had iron. No, it says that there were no blacksmiths at all among the Israelites. Perhaps the explanation is because the Philistines had such advanced weaponry, their smiths were all that were sought after, and their blacksmiths never passed on their trade to anyone of Israelite heritage. Thus, blacksmithing died out as a trade specifically among the Israelites at this point in history, and the Philistines could enforce that monopoly of trade. Regardless of one's understanding of this lack of blacksmiths, the point remains the same. The Philistines could keep their enemies from having weaponry, and even the tools needed for agricultural purposes had a hefty maintenance cost. A person would have to pay considerably for their daily life to continue. Only a king and princes could afford the exorbitant price of a simple sword, which is why only Saul and Jonathan had swords, while the rest of the army were armed with more primitive materials. Because their king held the ire of the Israelites' God, all they could see was the lack, their failings, their weakness. They had nothing that could be considered strength. And likely the few soldiers who remained with Saul were looking at the caves and caverns and the area around, wondering if they could escape this suicide mission like the rest of the army had when they fled. Verse 23 gives us one last bit of setup. The Philistines set up a garrison in Michmash, just out of the sight of the Israelite encampment, but close enough to keep pressure on their dwindling enemy. But little did the Philistines know that their proximity to the Israelites would be seen as an opportunity to one Israelite man. While Saul might be willing to sit there in fear and doubt, his son Jonathan knew that even in the face of terrible odds, God could provide victory to those who humble themselves before him. 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 1 to 5. One day, Jonathan the son of Saul said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave of Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. One crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Geba. This section of the text contrasts Jonathan with his father. Jonathan is active and planning. We might not be given his plan right now, but we know that he is on the move with a mission, and that he did not tell Saul his plans. Why? Because of the very difference between Jonathan and Saul. Chapter 14, verse 2 shows us a stagnant failure of a king with a tiny and fearful army, and his failure is highlighted by the presence of Ahijah. We're reminded of Eli's rejection by God because of his failure from earlier in the book. Remember Eli's death on the same day that his sinful sons died, and the birth of Ichabod, Mr. No Glory himself? Yeah, this guy's offspring. This is the crew that Saul gathered around him after Samuel left. The leftovers, the nobodies, the cursed priestly line who would never have a man among them see old age. Yeah, that's who you want going with you into battle. We see failure after failure when it comes to Saul, as he just sits there waiting with nobodies, with people who are cursed by God. And they do nothing. The contrasting juxtaposition of son from father does not end there. While Saul's sitting there, watching his lack, seeing only an army that can't do anything, Jonathan looks at impossible and insane odds, but still moves. Verses 4 and 5 tell us the treacherous path ahead of him. The two armies were each on their own side of a valley with a steep and craggy mountain to either side, just about a mile apart. Yet Jonathan went in a straight line toward the enemy. Not only would this mean that he and his armor-bearer would have to climb a steep incline toward the enemy, but any Philistine watching would be able to pick them off from afar. It's kind of hard to defend yourself from an arrow when your hands are busy keeping you from falling to your death on teeth-like rocks below. And on top of that, the names for the rocky crags were Bozez and Senna, which could be translated as slippery and thorny. Basically, good luck and flesh ripper. A modern story might use the terms rock and hard place. Yet Jonathan did not divert his path. He didn't try to go around the long way, didn't attempt to ease those odds a little closer to a sure thing. No, he headed straight on. Why? Because although he saw a miserable maybe from his human perspective, he knew the work of God and aligned himself with it. 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 6. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." This verse is core to the entire passage. These words show a humble man who sought to join God in his work of salvation and restoration. First, notice that Jonathan puts the problem into a godly perspective. He calls his armor-bearer to join him to go after these uncircumcised. He knows the godlessness of the Philistines. Sure, God might have refused the dynasty of Saul because of his sin, and Jonathan fully understood that he himself would never be king. But God had not abandoned Israel. He remained the faithful savior of the people, for those who would humble themselves to join in with the plan of God. So this meant that while God might have an issue with Saul and the Israelites like him, the Philistines were completely the enemy of God's work. Thus, defeating them was a part of that plan, and that is what Jonathan was going to go do. Secondly, we can see that Jonathan did not know that God's deliverance would come through this act. He wasn't sure. He says, maybe the Lord will work for us. He's standing unsure if this maybe will lead to success or failure. It might be in line with God's ways, but that in and of itself does not guarantee Jonathan's success. Only that this humble act will bring glory to God 100%. It's the right thing, even if it's the hard thing, and even if it's Jonathan's last thing. The prince doesn't move because he knows it'll all work out in the end for him. No, he moves despite those odds. That miserable maybe through a steep death trap toward a gigantic enemy army without backup? If things go poorly, there won't be a cavalry to sweep in and save the day. He could be marching to his death. But because he knows that it's the right thing to do, he moves anyway. This all might look like stupidity or some fearful delusion of grandeur to die heroically instead of waiting for the hammer to drop. But there is a reason that Jonathan steps ever closer to the Philistines. And that is because he knows God's ways. He tells the armor-bearer that God can save through many or through few. It's not the army, not the strength of their arms, not the ferocity of the soldiers that leads to victory. For Israel, victory has always come on account of God. He's won without a single Israelite. Remember chapter 6 with the Ark of the Covenant in the land of the Philistines. And God has won through small numbers many times throughout their history. It's not the numbers that are important, but the humility of God's people who join him in his holy work. And so come what may, Jonathan humbles himself to bring glory to God by joining him against the enemy. It is definitely the right thing to do, even if it looks like a maybe to human eyes. The beautiful power of faith shows itself in what follows those words. 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 7 to 15. And his armor-bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish, Behold, I am with you, heart and soul. Then Jonathan said, Behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, Wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, Come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand, and this shall be a sign to us. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, Look, Hebrews are coming out of holes where they've hidden themselves. And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor-bearer, and said, Come up to us, and we will show you a thing. And Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor-bearer after him. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer killed them after him. And that first strike which Jonathan and his armor-bearer made killed about 20 men within, as if it were half a furrow's length of an acre of land. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. True and humble faith in God is able to instill great faith in others. See the armor-bearer's response. Let's go do this. I'm with you. But even more importantly, notice that word, behold. Behold, I am with you. We've seen the Hebrew word that's translated into similar English words. And it was a humble response to join God's work then too. Yeah, it's Hineni. Here I am. Behold me, see me, witness me. What you see before you is one willing to go along with your plan, whatever that means. Behold, I am with you. And so with humility, the two men enact the plan. They'd reveal themselves in the valley, and if the Philistines told them to stay put, they would. The maybe would have proved its odds to be true. But if the Philistines told them to climb up, then it would be a sign that God was on their side and would grant the victory. When the Philistines saw the two Israelites, they made fun of the pair. Hey look, the Israelites are coming out of their hidey holes. Some of the people of Israel had already defected to the Philistine army, figuring that they'd join the winning side. Maybe these two were new recruits. Or maybe they would be new prisoners to toy with. Either way, the Philistines mocked the pair while telling them to come up. We got something to show you. Like maybe the pointy end of a sword. But when Jonathan and his armor-bearer heard the command to come up, it was as if God himself had given them the command. They smiled as they climbed. God had just given them the victory. That miserable maybe had just proven to become a sure thing. And the second that Jonathan's feet hit the top, he drew his blade, and it danced from enemy to enemy, felling each one in about a 30 to 45-foot area. And the armor-bearer double-tapped each fallen Philistine behind to make sure they were all dead. The work of God through that rapid alpha strike caused panic among the Philistines. Their terror made the very ground beneath their feet tremble, something that the rest of the Israelites had to notice. 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 16 to 23. And the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, Count and see who has gone from us. And when they had counted, behold, Jonathan and his armor-bearer were not there. So Saul said to Ahijah, Bring the ark of God here. For the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Now while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult of the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, Withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine's sword was against his fellow, and there was a very great confusion. Now the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time, who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed hard after them in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth-aven. Saul heard the Philistines' death throes and had to see who had just shown themselves to be the heroes of the people. The roll call came up missing only Jonathan and his armor-bearer. But Saul still didn't move quickly. No, he feared moving without a sure thing from God. So he asked Ahijah, the high priest from the cursed line of Eli, to ask God for a sure sign. But while Ahijah was in the middle of the divination, the sounds of the Philistines' defeat grew to a deafening roar. God was like, Is this not enough of a sign for you? And so finally Saul told Ahijah to stop the divination. He had his answer already. And Saul moved. Finally. He and the 600 soldiers with him. But they were not the only ones to fight against the Philistines that day. God caused confusion to be among the Philistines, so that they even fought each other. And those defectors of Israel, they joined Jonathan to fight against the Philistines. And then the cowards who had melted away from the army before came out of their hidey holes to join the battle. two humble and faithful people joined God, only to find him raise a massive army to sweep through the enemy that had seemed so big and bad before. From miserable maybe to a victorious sure thing, all because one man humbled himself and joined God in his work. This life has many maybes, but God's work is a sure thing for we who humble ourselves to join him in it. Does this mean that we'll always find a routing victory against the enemy? No. There have been many times when God's humbly faithful have fallen to the enemy plots and plans. Times when God's will allows his people to not be given the overwhelming victory for some reason. But God still has been given glory through their sacrifice. And his humble people have found growth, deliverance, and salvation through that seeming defeat. Remember that God himself, the second person of the Trinity, enfleshed in humanity, fell to a seeming defeat in order to bring salvation to all of us on a cross. He's not asking us to do something that he hasn't done himself before. What we can learn from all of this, though, is that we don't have to fear the maybes of life. Not if we're aligning ourselves with the ways of God. If we're joining his work. If we act in the most righteous, holy, and godly ways, we can be sure that he will be glorified and his humble people will grow because of it. Those maybes of life may terrify us. The leaps of faith may seem to be so costly. But if we're sure that it's in line with the will of God, it's as good as 100% sure thing. And there's no reason to fear. I don't know what your maybe is right now. What unknown leap of faith is staring you in the face. But I can say that God will bring deliverance and salvation to his humble people. So let's glorify our God by moving in faith instead of waiting for assurance that it'll work. Find the strength of faith in the midst of a miserable maybe. Because that strength is the might of God working through our humility.